But exactly where are we going to rank here, John L. Sullivan? Because simply guessing that Sullivan would beat Godfrey is a absolutely horrendously horrible way to try and rank fighters. A guess is nothing more than an artificial fact. And all it takes is one cut and the swing of a fight is changed and momentum's changed, and what you think is going to happen ain't necessarily exactly even similar to how the actual events could actually pan out. So I just want to take a moment here and we're going to review some of the heavyweight scene at the time for John L. Sullivan. And his fight with Jake Kilrain is in summer of 1889. So in the year 1890, the beginning of the new decade there were very few actual, real, legitimate heavyweights. The biggest three of the time, not counting American heavyweights I'm counting here, are Patsy Cardiff, Joe McAuliffe, and Pat Killian. Every one of these fighters wanted to fight with John L. Sullivan. And the worst of the bunch, Patsy Cardiff, was actually the one to get a fight with John L. Sullivan. Sullivan had a horrible performance against Cardiff as he broke his wrist and just basically lasted out the match, delivering not very much punishment to Cardiff. And Cardiff was rated the worst of the three. So how Sullivan would have did against Pat Killian or Joe McAuliffe, a true legitimate heavyweight at the time, weighing like 215 pounds, would have been very interesting. But instead, we're going to look here at George Godfrey. And Godfrey was going around actually fighting these fighters, unlike Sullivan. In 1890, he fought Patsy Cardiff. George Godfrey 172, Cardiff 176, and it took him 16 rounds of fighting to get a KO over Patsy Cardiff. So obviously Cardiff is showing some pretty good endurance, and the fact that he would have been able to push Sullivan a pretty good distance there, because he lasted 16 rounds with Godfrey. So a healthy Sullivan versus a healthy Cardiff, it would have taken Sullivan some time to probably be able to beat him. And Cardiff is the worst of the Joe McAuliffe and Pat Killian. Both of them beat Cardiff. So in Godfrey's next match, he fights 1890 in November against Denver Ed Smith. And this takes him 23 rounds to knock out Denver Ed Smith in a brutal fight. And he only won out of pure luck here because Smith's head hit a brick wall and rendered him unconscious. So Godfrey gets the match against their Denver Ed Smith. This very next match is in March of 1891, and he fights Kilrain and beats him in a 2-hour match. And Kilrain had some success. It took him a long time. That was his last stand, and he really beat Godfrey. So exactly how good is George Godfrey versus John L. Sullivan? It's pretty close there, I think. I think the both of them are ranked pretty close. Now you're wondering how John L. Sullivan against another fighter like some of the Australians like Peter Jackson. I think that Sullivan is significantly lower than Peter Jackson. I think we got to just worry about Sullivan beating the lower level of the Australian fighters, or fighters I'll describe it here. And I think that Sullivan versus Denver Ed Smith, who Denver Ed Smith was a very young fighter there, and he's going to bring a lot of youth. Had they fought in 1890, Denver Ed Smith versus John L. Sullivan, I think that probably, my guess would be in a 25-round match would be a draw. That would be how I would probably rank them. I think both of those are pretty even fighters. Even Sullivan getting up to the point of Denver Ed Smith, I think, is an achievement because Denver Ed Smith's rated pretty high here, and Sullivan showed in simulation that he could compete with Denver Ed Smith and beat him. So I think that's about where I would rank John L. Sullivan, is right close to Denver Ed Smith. I think he's probably better than Corbett and better than Godfrey, because those two are ranked right next to each other. Corbett and Godfrey as light heavyweights. They're peers right next to each other in simulation, fighting draws, and I think neither one of those, Godfrey or Corbett, are anywhere close to a higher level Australian fighter such as Godfrey or Slavin. They're just ranked higher than them. The lower end would be Denver Ed Smith, and I think Godfrey struggled with Smith in real life. I think Corbett would struggle with Denver Ed Smith, and I think that John L. Sullivan would have a pretty good match against Denver Ed Smith. I think he possibly could beat him, but I think that's right around where the cap for Sullivan was, and that's providing that everything was working in Sullivan's favor. He was in shape, he wasn't drinking, wasn't an alcoholic, and actually trained for a legitimate match. I think the world between Peter Jackson and John L. Sullivan is the Grand Canyon. I think Peter Jackson would have just carved up John L. Sullivan. I mean, it took Sullivan forever to beat Kilrain, and Kilrain said that he felt as if he was drugged during the match and he wasn't himself, and it still took him a long time to beat him. I don't think Kilrain would be able to match against Peter Jackson or Frank Slavin or Joe Goddard, and I don't think even a superior fighter as Sullivan was to Kilrain, I don't think he's in the league of any of those fighters. I just don't think he trained enough. I don't think he had enough rounds boxed to be able to actually compete with these fighters, because the American fighters had no boxing academy. They're self-taught, or the Australians were actually in academies. They're restricted or regimented. They're trained. They're trained like real boxers. The difference between a self-taught fighter and a boxing academy fighter is the Grand Canyon, and that's really the gap between the Australian fighters and some of these American pioneers who basically, their form of training is extremely primitive compared to a more modern type of boxer. And even though these fighters, the world-class Goddard, Slavin, and Peter Jackson, were only technically 2 years older than Sullivan, the difference in their rate of improvement was dramatic, and I think that Sullivan basically kept himself in neutral by not attempting to fight Joe McAuliffe and Patsy Cardiff again, and Pat Killian, because he would have improved dramatically had he actually had some rounds accumulated to try and make himself a more advanced boxer than what his actual peak was at. So he never had a chance for improvement, and that is handicapping him dramatically, in the fact that he's a pioneer and not using the training regimens of more advanced fighters after him is severely handicapping his true natural ability. And how I would rank John Sullivan is about even with Denver Ed Smith. I think that's giving John L. Sullivan about as much credit as I can give him, as I think those were about even. I think a lot of Denver Ed Smith and having Sullivan ranked close to him, I think, is an achievement, is how I would put it. So that's how I rank John L. Sullivan. But again, opinions aren't facts, and neither the simulation or my opinion is any type of actual rule of thumb to be using, because against any particular fighter, a number of things can go dramatically awry during a fight, and just assuming that Sullivan is going to walk over certain fighters is a horrible way to try and predict the future. So that's why I try and use simulation. So as I take my own judgment out of it, but that's how I would rank John L. Sullivan with my own judgment. I wanted to do some clarification here. I misspoke a few words there, calling Joe Goddard Godfrey by accident. And I just wanted to do some clarification on ranking here. So Patsy Cardiff, Joe McAuliffe, and Pat Killian, all of these fighters should have faced John L. Sullivan. Both Godfrey and Sullivan had their own struggles against Cardiff themselves. So none of those three appear in the top 60 of the Pioneer fighters. So it further emphasizes the point between where they were experiencing their struggles and where the foreign fighters of the time of Denver Ed Smith and Joe Goddard, Frank Slavin, and Peter Jackson were just light years ahead of them. So the simulation has shown you some plateaus here, and you need to kind of understand the plateaus. Now, Sullivan ranks on his plateau ahead of George Old Chocolate Godfrey and James Corbett. And Denver Ed Smith ranks ahead of them also. Even though George Godfrey beat Denver Ed Smith, simulation is showing you that sometimes in the very first fight, the better fighter does not win. And we've known that to be true through the course of history, and sometimes the fighter is able to get a upset over someone of a higher quality in the first match. And so as you kind of discover the plateaus here, as I stated, Denver Ed Smith would be towards the bottom of towards the bottom part of the foreign fighters of the 1890s there, the beginning fighters there. For John L. Sullivan to get up to the point of Denver Ed Smith, which is a higher plateau than either James Corbett or George Godfrey are at, is quite an achievement, and showing you John L. Sullivan's true potential is very high to be able to even consider begin ranked with Denver Ed Smith for clarification. As we know, Denver Ed Smith beat a very in his prime Joe Goddard, so I think most of those fighters are pretty much close to each other. Slavin did not face Goddard, but they sparred multiple rounds, and Slavin was considered superior to Goddard. So I think all of them are ahead of any American pioneer fighter at the time, with Pat Killian, George LeBlanc, Jack Dempsey, non-Perel Jack Dempsey, and John L. Sullivan. I think they're all ahead of him, as we could see by history is backing up the fact when Fitzsimmons came over and faced the very best version of an American middleweight in his prime, Jack non-Perel Dempsey. Fitzsimmons just cakewalked over him. So I think most of these foreign fighters of the early 1890s were far superior to the Jake Kilrain and John L. Sullivan. But for John L. Sullivan to even be considered with Denver Ed Smith, I think is pushing his true potential to the limit, and I think that's probably right around where he would cap out at without any further development being done by facing Pat Killian and Joe McAuliffe and some of the other fighters that he could have fought to further his peak at a higher rate, as he was just remained undeveloped. And even in the Kilrain fight, he was drinking brandy between rounds, and it was just no way to be attempting to try and fight a fighter of such a higher caliber in the foreign fighters. And in fact, John L. Sullivan ventured into Australia, and he got a first-hand look at the Australian fighters when he was still in his prime, and I think around 1890 is when it happened. And he wanted nothing to do with any of them after seeing them firsthand. He decided to continue to do his wares as stage acting, and he was actually laughed off the stage in Australia as he was trying to into stage portray a poor peasant man type of a role, and he was not very well received. And the famous story of the Wave of Australians, he and Joe Choyinski traveled together back to the United States as Sullivan was purely dejected, and he chose for himself not to want to fight any of these fighters, because I think even by his own eye he knew that he wasn't in the league as these guys. And I think given him the benefit of having the true potential of being able to be even with Denver Ed Smith is a rather ambitious attempt at his true potential. I don't think he was anywhere close to some of the better fighters of that time frame that were foreign fighters. So that is the ranking of John L. Sullivan.